Okay, so as you can see here, we're talking about using our calculators to help us support finding the values of some of the more complicated roots that you might see. So if, for example, here we see our radical symbol with no expressed value for our index, so we're assuming that that's going to be our square root. But look, this notation is telling us that we're looking for that negative root. Okay, so you might have a hard time thinking about what number, because remember, we're reversing our squaring process, so what number times itself is going to get you 16/25. So if that's a struggle for you, that's no big deal, right? We're going to pop over to our calculator, and you can even put in that negative symbol before, and then we're looking right at that x squared button, because right above it is just our regular principal square root symbol. So again, if we want to be able to get that negative root, we're going to have to put a negative in front of it. Okay, so we love this calculator, right? Because it's worth every bit of that $23 because it has that lovely N over D key. And so we typed it in exactly as it's shown, and then we get a value. So it tells us that the negative root of 16/25, I should say the negative square root, is negative 4/5. And we could check that. We could go back and we could square negative 4/5 in our calculator, and it's going to get us 16/25. So remember, our square root is reversing our squaring process. Okay, now if we look at something like number 2, so this is definitely one of those higher roots. So we have an expressed value for our index, and this is going to be 7. So we read this as the 7th root. Right, so we're thinking about a number being multiplied together 7 times. So repeatedly multiplied 7 times to get us 128. So that may be really hard for you just to kind of think through that one. So again, we can use that calculator to support. But now we're going to bump up one button right to that caret key. And this where you see that X notation right next to our radical symbol, that's what we're going to use for our higher roots. So we do have to type the index in first, and then you hit second, and then your caret key, and then you'll notice that it put that 7 in like a superscript notation. So that's very different than this. So if you notice, the 7 hasn't moved into the superscript notation, because what you're actually doing here is multiplying 7 times the square root of something. We don't want that. We want the 7th root of an expression. So we do need to make sure that we're using the appropriate key, and that we see that that index, that number we're using as our index, actually moves into a superscript notation. And so once I have that and I'm settled that, I'm actually using the proper radical key on my calculator, I can go ahead and type in that 128, and that's going to give me a value for 2. And again, we could check that. We could say, okay, 2 raised to the 7th power is 128, because remember, we're reversing that process with our roots. And if you notice, my calculator responded with the positive root there, right? So we've got the 7th root of 128 is going to be 2. There's no way that the 7th root of 128 is going to be negative unless I put a negative out in front of it. So just kind of keep these little things in mind. Okay, square root of a negative 16. Now, hopefully you remember from that first video that this is a non-real answer, because remember, our negative numbers do not have a real square root value. So, but this is for our square roots. Now, if you didn't catch that, no big deal. Your calculator is going to catch that for you, and it's going to tell you it's a domain error. And that has more explanation in college algebra, so I'm just going to leave it as, when you see that phrase domain error, you're going to respond with that non-real answer. Okay, so you might be thinking, oh, cube root of negative 8, I'm just going to go ahead and write non-real answer here. Well, the property for square roots of negative numbers does not hold for cube roots of negative numbers or any odd root of negative numbers. And that's because of the idea of how many times that number is getting multiplied. So in this case, it's getting multiplied 3 times to get to this -8. And if that was a 5, it would be multiplied 5 times. And if it was 7, it would be multiplied 7 times, and so on and so forth. So our odd roots can have a value for negative numbers. And so in fact, so I'm going to type in the 3 because this is a cube root and I want to make sure I'm using the appropriate radical symbol. So I do need my x radical symbol, and I made sure that that 3 went in our superscript notation, and I'm going to type in -8, and it's going to give me a -2. Now if you think about that, -2 times -2 times -2. So if you notice, I have an odd number of negative signs being multiplied together. So that's going to result in a negative answer. And then 2 times 2 times 2 is +8. So we get that the cube root of a -8 can be -2. So even roots of negative numbers will result in non-real answers, but odd roots of negative numbers result in negative answers.